friends. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Layton, and thank you for joining me in our journey to hope. It is my desire through this podcast to bring you information about how to discover, sustain, or perhaps regain hope. In this episode, I'm speaking with a new friend, Judith Henry. Now, I came across Judith through a mutual membership we have in a Facebook page for podcasters. I clicked on her link and was kind of curious about her. I'm glad I did, because I quickly saw that I wanted Judith to be a guest on the show. She and I are going to talk about something that I'm passionate about, she's passionate about, so we share that together. Hello, Judith.
Hey, hello.
Well, Judith, I want to chat with you not just about your book, The Dutiful Daughter's Guide to Caregiving, but also a little bit about your perspective as a caregiver, some of the things you went through and experienced, some of your insights, because I think it's so important that we care for our caregivers and we make it known to them that we appreciate them. To get started, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've been busy, Dave. After writing the book, actually a couple years after writing the book, I picked up my mom's old paintbrushes, which
Okay.
I brought home with me after she passed. She was an amazing artist. And I signed up for some classes and started painting using her brushes, and it was really love at first stroke. Plus, I just had this added joy of using her brushes and feeling more connected to her, which I had really been missing. And I started selling my work, then I started teaching, which I'm still doing and love it. And then just recently at 71, I started my own podcast. And I'm still kind of amazed that I did it, but I'm loving it. And it's called One Mouthy Dame, and which is the only title it could have been if you know me. And it's really about embracing our age with guts, gratitude, and good humor.
Yeah. Well, we have to laugh at ourselves.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, a sense of humor will see you through so many things, especially as a caregiver.
What was the actual energy behind you deciding to do a podcast?
Well, writing the book was a dream come true for me.
Yeah.
And I don't know, when I hit 71, it's sort of like I had this epiphany. It's like, you're 71, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? And of course, well, who knows how long that will be. But
Yeah.
the word empowerment came into my head.
Okay.
And when I was writing in my journal, and I just, out of the blue, this voice said to me, how about a podcast to empower women in their 60s and 70s and beyond to live their best lives? Because, we can. And so I think that's what generated the podcast idea. And of course, there was all the tech stuff involved. But, I watched YouTube videos and asked tons of questions, in the groups that you and I belong to, and made it happen. So I'm very excited about it.
Yeah. Well, I've listened to a couple of the episodes and they're entertaining. And that's the thing too. Before we started this session, you mentioned about your book, that you were pleased that it wasn't just women that enjoyed it, but guys too. And I think that's true about the podcast. It's not just for women. Although interesting, I'm putting a workshop together about caregivers, and I've mentioned that to you. It's amazing to me, the statistics that show so many caregivers are women. And that I say it doesn't surprise me.
Right.
That's just part of that nurturing element more so of women than most men. So I can see that. Okay. Well, podcasting is an enjoyable outlet as
Very
well
much.
as educational, and I enjoyed mine as well. So anyway, and by the way, after I post this podcast, I'll have in the show notes the links to your book, your
Oh, lovely.
Facebook page, as well as the podcast, because I want
Thank
folks
you.
to share in that.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to talk about the book because
Okay.
there's a lot of great information in it. Again, the Dutiful Daughter's Guide to Caregiving. You are creative on several levels. You mentioned about painting, teaching. I know that you do speaking as well and podcasting. So you're a very creative person, and it came through in the writing. It
Thank
was a
you.
very easy read, and
Good.
yet you offer humor as well as some very practical information and things we just don't even think about when we get into that element of caregiving.
I'll
So
just say this. We don't, as caregivers, as new caregivers, but throughout the process, so much of the time, we don't even know what we don't know yet until it hits us.
yeah,
And, that's one of the things about being able to handle this is the
yeah,
constant barrage of information and situations that come up that we're, being asked to help with
yeah.
all.
In the research that I did about caregivers, it also talks about the majority of us never anticipate that we'll be a caregiver. And yet there's a very strong likelihood that we can be for our spouse, even our children. We can go
Absolutely.
back into caregiving, but for parents. So I like that you wrote it, and I think it's important for folks to use anything they can to prepare themselves if they even think they might be a caregiver. And maybe not even the primary caregiver, but a secondary caregiver who brings relief to the primary. So yeah,
Exactly.
all of that's important. And so you provide that in the book very well. All right. I'm talking too much and I apologize for that. So talk a little bit about the book, why you wrote it, your inspiration for it, those sorts of things.
Okay. Well, I wrote it because I knew that it wasn't just me clearly going through this experience of caregiving. And so I wanted other adult children in, similar situations to feel heard and understood. And I wanted them to provide them with information, with all the things that I had learned as a caregiver. And I mean, it was a tremendous amount and it was a daily occurrence. And so I just decided the best way to share this was in the format of a book. And I'd say what inspired me really, first of all, would be my parents.
Mm-hmm.
I think they were the initial inspiration because I watched them deal with, declining health, with a healthcare system that, in my opinion, is not always great at treating older adults for a
Okay.
host of reasons. I mean, that would be another
Okay.
show entirely, but um, and yet I watched them live their lives with such courage. And I thought, wow, I mean, what role models they are for me.
Okay.
So that was the initial inspiration. And then the other thing was, I really wanted to write a book that I could have used when I was caregiving. And so to me, that meant, something small and lightweight that I could throw in my purse and read in a doctor's waiting room or a hospital room. Something that would make me laugh because sometimes humor was the only thing that got me through some days. I wanted to sort of be lifted out of caregiving sometimes. So something with stories, something that, like I was just reading a great book of stories. And then, ultimately, I wanted to be able to give information to caregivers that would be short, direct, easy to read, easy to take in because
Yeah,
our
bottom
minds are
line.
on such overload.
Okay.
And so, and so that's what I did. I essentially wrote the book that would have been helpful to me when I was doing my caregiving.
You could have named it The Practical Daughter's Guide as well, because it is full of practical information. You explain terms, you talk about forms, some things that, again, we don't think about, the living will, the do not resuscitate, all of those things that are so important as the person is aging and
Yeah,
things
and
we need to
essentially,
prepare for.
well, we all do, really.
Yeah,
These are things
yeah.
that we all should be looking at. But I did want to mention one thing that, the reason that I used that title, The Dutiful Daughter,
Uh-huh.
um, initially I worried, I thought, oh, are people going to think I'm sort of sounding sarcastic or whatever. But the irony is that I got this from my dad, who who I was racing to get over to see him one Saturday, and I was very anxious. And I was driving with my head out the car window like a dog on a road trip. And I got to his house 15 minutes later than I typically would be there. So I got there at 9:15 in the morning instead of 9. And I walked in the door and he said to me, well, well, the dutiful daughter is finally here. And, at that point, I had a couple choices. I could have started crying. I could have gotten angry, or I could have gone over and kissed his head and said, thanks, Dad. You just gave me a great title for my book.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah,
what I did. So
yeah.
that's how the title of the book came about. It
Okay.
was my dad's name.
Um, it sounded like, as I read through your mentions about your dad, he must have been a little bit of a rascal.
Oh, more than a little bit. More than a little bit. He
Yeah,
he lived life on his own terms,
there
and
you
uh,
go. Yeah,
and though it was challenging at times, I had so much respect for him. So
yeah. Oh, yeah. Uh, Sometimes it's difficult to write about someone or something that's very close to us. Did you experience a little bit of that as you wrote?
I did not actually. For me, the book was very healing,
Okay.
and from it, I really came to terms with not being the perfect daughter and not being the perfect caregiver, but realizing after all was said and done that I did the very best I could for them in very, very difficult and challenging situations. And knowing that helped me grieve their loss and really just, move forward.
Uh-huh.
So the writing of it was a very powerful experience for me,
Okay.
actually.
They tell us as we write, and I've had the opportunity to publish several books. They ask us or talk to us about writing what you're familiar with. And so, of course, you were very familiar with your family situation and all of that. So you had a wealth of resources from which to draw. I've always struggled with put this in, but don't put that in, or I think I'm finished with a chapter and then something else will jump out.
Sure. Oh, sure.
The book is well written, and I mean that sincerely and enjoyable. I didn't take me long to read it. I'm not necessarily a fast reader, but it just you move through it. And there were some things that stood out, and I wanted you to talk about some of the information. Couldn't cover everything, so I selected four chapters that they really spoke to me as I went through them, and I went back to them. I said, well, that's I identify with them significantly. So that's what I'd like a little bit more of your insights on. And by the way, before we get into this, it is okay for caregivers to have emotions and to deal with those emotions. Sometimes we feel like I've got to be in such control of myself, I can't show my emotions or whatever. And No, you are human. You've got the
Absolutely.
same emotions. Now we do control ourselves as best we can, and we get over frustrations or something like that.
I think we have to feel what we feel without judgment,
Yeah.
because that ultimately is the way forward to healing. It's when we repress it and keep it in, or worry about what somebody else might think, that problems can occur. So I'm all for feeling it and saying it and moving forward.
Well, let's look at some of the chapters. Chapter 9, you titled it "A Stitch That Holds It All Together." By the way, are you a middle child?
No, actually, I'm the oldest.
Oh,
Um,
really? Okay.
I have a brother who's 2 years younger and a sister who is 7 years younger.
Well, I love the story of the hamster.
I still
That
feel bad about that, but
that just had me laughing out loud. Um,
good.
you didn't like shots, neither do I.
Right, right. I
So
was
you and
ready
your
to
brother were
barter
going to get
anything.
y'all were going to get shots, and
Yep.
nurse comes out and says, "Who's first?" And you looked over at your brother and said, "If you'll go ahead, I'll let you have my hamster." And as he's walking in the door, he goes, "You don't even have a hamster." Oh man.
Oh, I can still see his little face. That look of, oh no, what have I done?
we That's why I asked if you were a middle child. So, but you mentioned something in there, and I guess that's one of the things we've talked about a little bit. You used the expression compassion fatigue, and that's what I wanted to chat a little bit about.
Okay, it is really such a common occurrence with caregivers. And I think the reason is that, we take on this enormous sense of responsibility and obligation towards helping to care for, this family member. And, we think to ourselves, we're adults, we're mature, we should know how to do this, this, and this, we should know how to handle it. But it is an enormous responsibility, and it is not something that one single person can possibly absorb and take in without it affecting them. And so what happens is that our mind and our body and our spirit can become just depleted. We are worn out from trying to be this perfect child slash caregiver. And what can happen is that we become irritable, we can become depressed, and we actually can find ourselves distancing from the very person that we are caring for.
Right.
And it's not that we don't love them, it's we are human. And our minds and our bodies are just simply tapped out and need a break. And we've got to learn to cut ourselves some slack.
Yeah.
And that's one of the hardest things, I think, for caregivers to do.
And that's
So,
why I mentioned it's okay to have emotions and to feel those emotions and deal with them. Uh,
yes.
you know, I read a statistic somewhere back when my wife's father and uh, her mother were going through treatment, and we had to put her dad in assisted living and all of that because it got to the point his medication, his medical care, we could not take care of. But I read statistics that talked about the length of time somebody is in care. It can be a year and a half to 2 years, kind of an average. So that it can be a long time, and you almost feel like you put your own life on hold.
No
And
question.
yeah,
No
so
question.
we
I mean,
understand that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I went through so many ringtones on my phone because it got to where I was like one of Pavlov's dogs. When I would
Okay.
hear the ringtone of the phone, I would immediately start to panic.
Hmm.
What has happened? And it's because I was trained through that ringtone. So I
Okay.
was constantly changing them. to try to head that off. But
Okay.
it's what happens.
Mhm.
Our lives have become totally focused on this, and it's hard to step back.
Yeah. And there were some other things that you mentioned in the chapter, that I think very practical things again. That there's you list some things that you can do to minimize the stress of being a caregiver. I thought the first one was to me one of the most difficult. That is asking for help or
Mhm.
allowing someone to help. I'm always the guy in charge,
Right.
um, and so for me to be in that position. I learned as a patient, I learned humility and to turn loose. But
Mm-hmm.
for caregivers, a lot of times, if you're a take charge kind of person, it's
Right.
hard to ask help. I want it a certain way, or I like it this way, or I just don't feel like someone else could provide the level. So to me, that was one of the ones that were most important. You do need help.
You absolutely do. And the thing is, again, it's just like you said, we think we can handle it all because we've been handling our own lives,
Hmm.
you know. And so um, people will ask, what can I do to help? Or let me help. And often our first response is, oh no, it's okay, thanks, I've got it. But the thing to realize is that the level of caregiving can change on a dime
Okay.
with a fall, a diagnosis, and suddenly what seemed manageable is suddenly unmanageable, and we've got so much stuff coming at us. So if we've been saying to people who are offering, no, I've got this, at some point people stop offering because we're not
Yeah.
taking them up on it.
Yeah.
And that's often when we need them the most. And so to me, if somebody asks, give them something to do that will help. And it doesn't have to be big. And we need to also consider who's doing the asking because, you may have a friend who is a great listener and you can vent and cry and yell and whatever, and they listen and they don't judge and they make you feel heard. And that's wonderful. But, the neighbor you don't know that well, a couple doors down, is not going to be the person you're spilling your guts to, but that person could be someone who, picks up a Costco chicken for you that night for
Yeah.
dinner, or
Yeah.
runs an errand for you, or comes and sits with your caree while you take a nap or go out for a walk. So I think allowing people to help is a boon for you, and it's also for them. So that's how I look
Okay.
at the helping
There,
thing.
as I was reading it too, there was another dimension of that that came to my mind, and that is that over some time, as we are so close to what's going on, we don't realize that we might not be providing the level of care we need to or could, not a deliberate thing, we just don't realize it. And maybe even over this period of time, the level of care we're providing might sort of go down a little bit in terms of quality or whatever. We just don't realize it. It's not that we're trying to or anything.
Right.
We're just not doing as well as we could. So sometimes taking that break and
Yes,
bringing in and
absolutely.
listening to another person help, uh,
Absolutely.
that helps us as well. So,
Yeah, most
yeah.
definitely.
Okay. There is joy in being a caregiver. There's stress as well. So you handled very well some practical things that you went through, how to minimize it, those sorts of things. Okay. Well, that was chapter 9. And then you
Okay.
moved into chapter 13, and this was, wow, letting go.
Yeah.
I love the story, by the way, of the Episcopalian priest. And as I read that, the lesson I took from it is all of us need some help. And so it's good for us to overlook our differences um, and then look at what we have in common and use that in serving someone. And so I appreciated that person, even though you came from different backgrounds in your faith. Uh, that person was there and was willing to help and be a part of it. So
Yeah, it's I'm still so moved by it. It was
yeah,
an experience I'll never forget. But, here is this man that I did not know, not of my faith, but he came in and he just sort of assessed the situation and, said this prayer of healing and letting go and understanding and release. And it was exactly what I needed at that moment in time.
yeah,
And I will forever be grateful to him because it really did help me just calm myself and be there for my dad, at the end.
yeah. And he understood that. He understood what you needed, and the artificial barriers, the man-made barriers that we grasp on so hard.
Yeah,
That's just not a part of this.
he just went right through them. And, I wish my dad had been conscious because I think he would have loved this
Oh
story.
yeah,
It would have
yeah,
totally appealed to him.
yeah. You know, we have a chaplain at Cancer Center that I really enjoy. Taurus is his name. He's an amazing man. He has such a calming spirit about him,
Mhm.
and the patients just love it when he swings around and visits and spends some time, and that's just an important thing. Again, that goes back to helping us as caregivers to provide even better care. By the way, I appreciated in your writing of this time, you were sharing some intimate time that you had with your father. That's so powerful in the
Thank
book.
you.
I
Thank you.
appreciated that. So that was a great chapter, 10:4, Daddy-O, letting go.
Yeah.
That's just a challenging thing. Okay. Chapter 17 is the next one, using laughter and hospice in the same sentence. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of hospice, and I was like so many other people. Hospice means okay, that's it,
Yeah. Yeah.
life's over. But when I spoke with a hospice provider, episode 39 of my podcast, I loved it because she just
Yeah.
expanded my horizons. And so again, it's not just they're there for end of life. They're there to help you and the person. And she said, we rejoice when we find out somebody doesn't need hospice or they graduate from hospice. They actually pull them. Wow.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know your insights with
Amazing.
hospice care.
Well, I listened to that episode that you did with Chastity, and I
Yeah.
loved it. I was nodding my head through the
She was great.
entire. She was great, and you were as well. The two of you echoed so many of my own sentiments about
Okay.
hospice. And the thing that I saw was, I think there is such a misperception about
Mhm.
hospice as being that last brief time before someone passes. It's one of the most valuable services I could imagine for Medicare to offer because we learned, and of course I had done some research on hospice beforehand, but it we're all terminal. I think you said that
Yeah.
in your thing as well, and I loved it because we are, and the difference is, well, how are we going to live until that happens? And that's what it's all about. And so I feel very strongly that hospice can help give people often a better quality of life well before that final time, which none of us know that.
Yeah.
And so with my own mom, we had both talked about hospice and felt that yes, when it was time, we were going to do this. And she had a surgeon who said, well, we could do a surgery and replace a valve. And we looked at him like, she's 90 years old, and I said, why are we not talking hospice now? And he switched instantly and said, well, I would be fine with writing an order saying that hospice should become involved. So that comment that you had made, or Chastity, about oftentimes the physician is waiting for the family member to say something. was very, very true in our case. And she went home from the hospital, and for 3 months, life was good. They took her off, the hospice doctor took her off a med that had been causing mini
Yeah.
strokes,
Yeah.
and she was able to enjoy this last 3 months. It gave us a chance as her family to say the things we wanted to say to her and she to us, and tell stories and be together. And, right up until the very end.
Yeah.
And so for us, hospice was a tremendous gift, and I can't say enough good
Yeah.
things about
And you're saying something without actually coming out and saying it directly, that the hospice care helps the caregiver as well as the
it.
recipient.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of times they offer, follow-up
yeah,
therapy sessions, but they're also there if you have questions. They're very patient. They're very understanding. So it's an amazing service, really
yeah.
is.
Chastity talked about it in that episode of education is a big portion of it. Education for the caregiver to provide medications and other
Yeah.
things. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And we saw that in a very dear friend of ours that passed away this past year. He was a mentor of mine for many years, and as he was ending his life, uh, hospice came in, and so we saw firsthand the addition to the quality of life and the dignity
Yes.
of living in those last time that he had. We really appreciated it, not only for him but for his wife Mary Alice as well. Okay. Chapter 21. I told you it touched me. It really did. A short chapter, one paragraph or two? Very short.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one last thing is the title of it. And I knew when I started reading, it's like, oh boy, that's a challenge. But thank you again for sharing that intimate moment. Your final sentence, that's the one that touched me. Um, it might not have been your intention, but again, my takeaway is that don't wait until afterwards to share our love with someone. Let them know. Um, we think about there's so many things I wish I would have said. And some things don't have to be said, but it's important if we can to let them know.
I
Yeah.
appreciated that takeaway, because for me, that really was ultimately the whole book.
Okay.
And um, there's a wonderful book out by Dr. Ira Byock, and it's called The Four Things That Matter Most. And what it is, it refers to our four sentences to use in any relationship. And those four sentences are, please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, and I love you. And those
Okay.
four sentences are the foundation for healing any relationship. Those are the things that need to be heard and said. And so for me, that's what this was all about, saying the things that need to be said, because as you mentioned, I think regret can be tremendous when somebody passes. And it can keep us stuck in grief a lot of times because we wish we had said something or we wish
Okay.
we hadn't said something.
Yeah.
And so to know that those four things can help heal a relationship, or move it forward, I think is very powerful. So
I appreciate you sharing those. Sometimes as guys, we don't share as well as we ought to. We need to learn to, especially with those that we love. Just a little insight into me, and I don't really want to make this about me, but I share with what you wrote in there because I was raised in an orphanage in my early years, and in the times, the late 50s, early 60s that I was in the orphanage, that was the social structure at the time. You didn't have foster homes and things of that nature. And so I'm trying to finish a book about the history of the orphanage, and it was a Catholic orphanage. They took extremely good care of us and all of that. And so I'm trying to write the history of it and what it was like to be a child growing up in there, and some of my experiences. But anyway, the last chapter of the book, I titled "I Stand on the Shoulders of Giants," because there were four men in my life that as I grew up, post-orphanage time, as a troubled teenager and not going in a good direction, over periods of time, these four men were just so incredibly important to me. And I am thrilled that those four men knew how much I appreciated them and told them that and shared with them how important they were. So I think it's just important that we do that. It's good for us. It's absolutely good for them to know that. So anyway, all right, sorry. What else? Those were some of the chapters that meant a lot to me. I appreciated the whole book. Well, Judith, thank you. Sincerely, thank you for being a guest on this episode, for being a new friend. By the way, I reserve the right to bring you back again sometime in the future.
I'd be
I would love
delighted,
to.
and I truly appreciate the invitation, Dave. It's been lovely. Really,
Yeah,
I've been.
well, again, getting to know people through the podcast is such a joy as well. All right, well, let me wrap up. Friends, thank you for joining Judith and I as together we are on a journey of hope. I trust in some small way we have encouraged you to discover, sustain, or regain hope through this effort. I invite you to contact me if you have any questions or comments, or if you wish to share with me something you've experienced in your journey to hope. My email is info@ourjourneytohope.com. That's info@ourjourneytohope.com. And please share this podcast with someone whose hope is being challenged. And one more thing real quick, I will have in the show notes information about the book, the podcast as well. Gain that insight that you so well provide.
Thank you.
Well, I look forward to sharing more with you soon. Again, I'm Dr. Dave Layton, and thank you for listening. And until our next episode, remember, we give all glory to God our Father.